This timeline's pretty sensitive. A dynamic timeline always operates on a single timeline. However, that timeline is very susceptible to change anytime somebody time travels. Dynamic timelines strongly operate on the principle of cause and effect. Whatever the logical outcome of your time travel is, does change the future. This typically results in the timeline being rewritten. And so even though you have a single timeline, the way the timeline looked after you time travel and change history is going to look completely different than how it did originally or beforehand. And traveling forward in time doesn't make any change to the timeline because you're just moving forward in time faster than everybody else. However, traveling backwards in time to return to where you came from may result in the future being rewritten because you went missing for however much time you travel forward, so going back and staying in the past results in a change of the timeline. This also applies to how the timeline handles paradoxes. Whenever a paradox occurs, the timeline will alter itself and rewrite reality itself if necessary in order to reconcile the paradoxes. So if we use the grandfather paradox as an example, you go back in time and kill your grandfather, and then time now has to rewrite itself to reconcile the paradox that your grandfather is dead before giving death to your birth parents. The two most common ways that time will reconcile itself in a dynamic system is either deleting you from the timeline, so that logically everything makes sense, your grandfather mysteriously dies, and therefore you don't exist, or this will result in a loop where time undoes the death of your grandfather and your time travel, because logically you going back and killing your grandfather doesn't make sense, which unintentionally results in a loop. Whether or not time progresses after the loop depends on the timeline system. Typically when a timeline is rewritten, even if it is completely changed, if the time traveler is still alive, they still typically remember the non-existent version of the timeline and all of the events that technically never happened. Though this is not always the case. In some systems, memories are erased. Whether or not the entire timeline rewrites itself seems to depend on how substantial of a change you make. This gets into a whole nother issue we'll talk about in paradox analysis, but it has to do with the substantial change clause and basically how big of a change do you have to make in order for the universe to react. For example, going back in time just to watch and then coming back to the future more than likely will not result in the timeline rewriting itself. In conclusion, the dynamic timeline is an extremely sensitive model that needs to be handled with great care when you are a time traveler. Any little change could potentially rewrite the entire future, depending upon how sensitive your specific timeline happens to be. And there always runs the risk of deleting yourself from existence.